Hey guys, it's been a while, and it's certainly been a while since you saw me present in this format. We're going to be going back to something like this for a while, for reasons that I will get into more specifically at some point down the line. But just know that this is what things are going to look like again for a while in all of my stuff. You're not going to be seeing a lot of face cam for a while, but content will start trickling back in soon. This is the first of many return videos to come. I'm just going to be kind of taking it slow at first to make sure that I don't kind of overdo it while I'm getting back in the groove. And in the interest of not overdoing it, I decided to stick with something that I know really, really well, and that is a Steven Universe theory. As you can tell by, the style of video and the title. Specifically, we're going to be looking at something that was brought up in an ask that I got recently over on my Tumblr, which I still do have. You guys should check it out. The gist of which was, now that we know that Yellow Diamond has been repairing broken gems, is there any reason to think that she might someday repair all of the gems that went into making the cluster? And could she? If we assume that the gems that make up the cluster can be broken back apart, which I don't see why they couldn't be, they're gems and they're breakable, is it possible that Yellow Diamond could take all of those fragments, separate them back out, reassemble them into their original forms, and restore them? And I think that the answer to that is a resounding yes. Given ideal conditions, I think that is a thing that could absolutely happen. The question that I want to answer here is, would it? Would it be possible outside of absolutely ideal conditions, and would it happen given the characters involved? That being not just Yellow Diamond, but the cluster itself. Because while the individual gems that make up the cluster don't really exist anymore in an individualistic sense, the cluster itself is a character made up of the psyches of all of those people. And it should absolutely get a say in what happens to it as well. But first, let's talk about those ideal conditions that I talked about. Even when we see Yellow Diamond reassembling gem fragments into gems and restoring them, there's still a little more work that needs to be done aside from just putting the pieces back together to reform the gemstone. We have to assume a couple things to understand the point that I'm about to make, things that may not be accurate, but they certainly seem like they are to me. First of all, we have to assume that because repairing cracks in gemstones is possible, the cracks in the gems that Yellow Diamond puts back together are fixed. We have to assume that. Otherwise, if they ever poof by accident and their physical form isn't there to hold the gemstone together, they're just going to fall apart again, which I can't imagine would be Yellow's goal here. I can't imagine that she would settle for that. So while we never really saw Yellow Diamond have the ability to fix cracks in gemstones, we have to assume that because it's possible, that is something that's being done as part of this process. But we also do see Yellow Diamond using her ability to permanently, or at least, until she undoes or redoes it permanently, alter the physical form of a gem once it has formed its body. Using that power to fix glitches in the gem's physical form caused by what seems to be persistent damage to the gemstone. And if the gemstone really is being repaired, I can't imagine where that damage would come from except from fragments that were broken off when the gem was shattered that were too small to recover. Think about it like this. When's the last time you dropped something glass or ceramic? And don't pretend like you haven't. I know we all have at least one time in our lives. I bet you thought at least once when you dropped something and broke it like that, hey, I could put this back together. Until you started picking up the pieces and realized that some of them were just too small to handle. Pieces that were like the size of a grain of sand, or about as big around as a grain of sand, but thinner, like paper thin even. Pieces that when you really get down there and look at them, you're like, I wouldn't even know where to start finding where this fits, and this is like a vase or something, so like, it can't even have tiny holes in it. The best I could maybe do is like fill the holes in with glue, which sounds like more trouble than just getting out a different bowl or whatever. So you just end up throwing the whole thing away. Gems are not actual gemstones. We've talked about this before. They're little crystal computers, but they share a lot of properties with an actual gemstone. And that is, if one were to shatter, it would leave behind tiny little fragments like that, too. Fragments that could get swept away with the dust by accident or fall into the dirt and get mixed in, never to be seen again. And this would be bad enough with just a few fragments at a time, but given the millions of fragments that went into making the cluster, that would be exponentially more opportunities for small fragments to have been lost forever. Fragments that might contain crucial information that the gem would need if it were put back together. the lack of which would leave that gem in a worse state than it is now as part of a greater being. We also have to assume that all fragments are available. For the same reason, once enough lost data is accumulated, the gem can't be remade anyway, so there wouldn't be a point. We have to assume then that every single fragment of every single gem that was used in the cluster was put into the cluster. That they never, went out to a battlefield after it was over and, hoovered up a few fragments, but missed some. Or that they didn't use any of the fragments from the gems that went into the cluster in some of the smaller cluster experiments. Because the last assumption that we have to make is that the components within the cluster would want to separate and be put back in their original bodies. Remember, the entire reason that the cluster decided to bubble itself rather than emerge and destroy the Earth was because Stephen taught them to find companionship in one another, forming that amalgam psyche that became the cluster in the first place, creating that new person. Given that that happened, would the cluster want to be separated in the first place? And I really don't think it would. At the very least, I think it's up in the air whether or not it would. And if it turned out that not all of the gems involved in making the cluster have all of their pieces available, so some of them would have to remain fragments anyway, I especially don't think that the cluster would want to be separated then, because I don't think it would want to abandon those pieces of itself, which is the main and biggest reason why I think, even though it is hypothetically possible to restore the cluster, it's not something that would ever happen. If the show continued tomorrow, I don't think this is something we'd ever see. I would argue that, narratively speaking, the cluster has served its purpose. It doesn't need to be there anymore. It would absolutely make sense from a pure storytelling perspective to remove the cluster from Earth and turn it back into other gems, but character-wise, I think that would be a betrayal of the cluster's character as we understand it, and would not actually be feasible in practice without assuming that conditions are absolutely perfect, which they rarely are. Even in fiction where you can make up the world, it's hard to justify painting circumstances as perfectly ideal. Which is one of the reasons why I still love Steven Universe so much. The fact that we can come back years after the show ended and talk about a character like the Cluster, who wasn't really much of a character to begin with, in this much depth, and understand it so well, placing it in the context of later episodes that it wasn't even involved in, spawning an entire new discussion of things. That's just an example of how this show is so great. I will be continuing my Steven Revisverse series soon, and I do hope that people send me more Steven Universe related questions on Tumblr or here on YouTube. That would be fun too, because I really would like to talk about the show much, and I'd really like to do so based on some of you guys' suggestions. So let's get that rolling if we can. And of course, I'd like to know, what is your take on this specific topic? Do you think the cluster would want to be broken up and restored to its original form if that were possible, if that were a thing that it turns out could actually happen? As per usual, let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below. But in the meantime, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.